we're finding that without three things, climate art doesn't produce a lasting effect.
Welcome, Wild Ones. This is Josh Schlossberg, host of the Green Root Podcast, the official podcast of Eco Integrity Alliance, where we're on a quest to uncover the roots of the ecological crisis. I'd like to welcome this week's guests, Fran Kremer and Carol Rhodes. Fran Kremer is co-founder of Uniting Artists and Scientists for Climate Action. She was a senior scientist with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's research office, serving nearly 4 decades until 2025. Carol Rhodes is the founder of Artists for Climate Awareness, a growing arts group based in Bloomington, Indiana, that helps people connect with climate issues through creativity. A longtime watercolor artist with deep nonprofit experience and a background in training at Indiana University, she blends her skills to help people feel ready to make change. The issue of art as it ties into environmental issues, that's really close to my heart. I actually consider myself pretty much an artist first who also does advocacy and organizing, mostly because my source of inspiration, nature, is constantly assailed. So I feel like I have to do this stuff. But I'd be curious to hear from each of you just how is art relevant to any form of climate, environmental, or just advocacy in general?
Well, I could start. One of the key issues that we've thought about is in terms of really drawing the public into this issue and really getting an emotive response. So it is the visual and performing arts that help people to engender that emotion. And for me, spending a career in research where I, as other researchers, our main endpoint is producing articles and in our case with EPA research that for use in policy and regulations. And while in recent years before I retired, there was an emphasis about bringing in the public and engaging public in science, that was just really getting started, but felt that, we've had this large body of work, but this is not reaching people. It's not in helping in terms of their decisions. And so how do we do this in a way they can really come to these issues? And no better way to do this than thinking about art and making an easy entry point, and again, this emotive response to help get folks engaged.
Great, thanks for that. And what about you, Carol?
Yeah, studies show that there's a more lasting impression when people are exposed to knowledge through art. Of course, you can lecture people and you can give them all kinds of data and they don't respond, but there's a sort of deeper, as Fran put it, emotive language of art that resonates with people and can spur them to action. And so that's where we are. We're sort of, obviously, people are feeling the effects of climate change right now. But there's a cerebral aspect that leads to denial. And we feel that art can break through that barrier.
Yeah, I really agree with that. I'm a musician and a writer, I don't see the reaction to my writing as much, right? Because how would I? Maybe at a public reading or something like that. But with music, I do, and I realize, yeah, how much it really seems to impact people, particularly if it's songs they like or maybe songs they dislike, compared to my advocacy work, which I'm not obviously just doing this for pats on the back, but it's just really interesting that I can go into a place and play a 3-minute Grateful Dead
Yeah.
cover and people are dancing, people like applaud, people come up to me. I can do environmental stuff and
Yeah.
sure, people engage, but it's a very different kind of engagement.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And I think it's
and
the lyrics, it's the words, and it's also sorry. It's a way
yeah,
how we can use those lyrics in touching people one of the groups we're also working with is the Climate Music Project out of San Francisco. And they are doing a beautiful job in really bringing in different genres of music and different musicians. So they work with classical to hip hop to jazz and also do data sonification. So they're taking data and sonifying that. So we're collaborating with them as well to bring music into our sphere and again integrating that with the visual arts.
It's excellent. Any thoughts on that,
Yeah,
Carol?
and I was going to say that how you present the art, it is really important. So there are a lot of climate art shows. There are a lot of climate art websites out there, and studies show that simply viewing climate art rarely produces actual lasting behavior change. It can open the door and make people feel, connected to it, but then um, after they leave, the door sort of quietly swings shut again, and they go about their lives feeling like they did a good thing by viewing art or experiencing the art. And you mentioned music, and you mentioned how people really engage with it, and that's really important. So in all my research and in my experience in hosting a lot of events, we're finding that without three things, um, it doesn't produce climate art doesn't produce a lasting effect. And and for everybody, I'd just like to point out that um, participation, agency, hands-on involvement is really important. It turns emotion into commitment, and that's where music can be very, very powerful because it is interactive. Um, Artists for Climate Awareness does a lot of hands-on workshops in conjunction with education, and that gives people a sense of agency, and it enables them to sort of work through reticence of going out and talking about it. And so hands-on is really important. Stories are really important, and that's where film comes in. They help viewers understand what they're feeling and why it matters. And then it's also important, and this is something that we try to do too, is have a multimedia experience. So you don't just walk through a gallery, you play music, you have people participate in it, and that's a much more powerful and lasting way to make art be a messenger for you. Narrative, that's stories. Participation gives people agency, and multimedia experience layers memory and makes it more powerful.
Got it. That's great to know. Yeah, so there's been something that I've been framing recently regarding this particular issue I'm working on here in, well, Colorado in the West and the US around public lands protection. But I think it's relevant overall for maybe environmental and climate issues and maybe beyond that. So what ends up happening is, so there is a narrative, there's a strong narrative in this case for extraction. So what I frame it as, they have a story, but it's very compelling, and then they have status, because I like, alliteration. So they have status of people that we have science and we have substance, so substantial arguments. But without that status, and probably more importantly, that story, we don't really get our stuff out there, particularly when the other story, in this case, this is to do with public land stuff. It's a lot of, you're going to make money and also you'll die unless we cut down all the forests. That's a pretty darn compelling story there. And our story is just, nuh-uh. It's like, we got to do better than that. So yeah, I totally agree. The story is essential. And the difference that we would be doing is that our story would be based on science, unlike their story, which is based on propaganda. So yeah, any thoughts on that or anything else?
I can give it to
I
Fran.
think
I have
one
some
of the
thoughts too.
ways that we're looking at this too is to have a conversation about how do we best integrate the data with the science, and but doing it in a way that it presents it so people feel it's approachable. And so we just had our opening earlier this month, launching UASCA with Artists for Climate Awareness. And with that, we brought in nationally known artists and local artists. And we as well had music who combining this with really emotive power, great lyricist in the band. And just as one example, Jill Pelto, who's out of Washington State, just does phenomenal work. So she's both a scientist and an artist. And so she does a nice blend of really incorporating data on the glacial decline and integrating that data in her work. And the work is just stunning, but yet the data is there showing the decline of the glaciers in a way that's subtle, but yet very pronounced. So it's something that you would hang up in your living room. And certainly that art piece can stir conversation. As well, we have another artist from Oklahoma who's focused on wildfires. And so he brings in the natural landscape and the wildlife to look at wildfires and in terms of what are the next steps. So this is their land, this is our land as in terms of populations, but their survival is critical to our survivability as well. So really bringing in those voices. And then we brought in local artists too, who were really eloquent in advancing ideas. And one local artist, Claire Hearn, had a beautiful mural that showed the forest and the beauty of the forest, and then coming out really in a 3D what that extraction would look like, what does development look like, and how does this, again, provide an emotive response to how we're using our public lands or other lands wisely or not.
Great. Carol?
Um, yes, and I'm reminded of when we began as a group of artists in late 2021. Um, we were sitting around. It was after one of the COP conferences, and I can't tell you which number it was, but we were pretty despondent. And the idea was, well, what can we do? What can we do? And one of us said, well, maybe we can do what we do best, which is make art. Well, that's great. And as I began to form the organization, this initial group of artists said, well, what can we say if we're not scientists? How can we be experts, and how can we legitimately influence people? And my response is, we don't necessarily have to be scientists. We can produce the data and express it in this way, without having to say we're the experts. And I think that the beauty of the joining of UASCA and Artists for Climate Awareness is the infusion of scientists in the work who help inspire the art. And Artists for Climate Awareness is sponsoring a project that's initially called Brushes for a Better Planet, where scientists are mentors. The artists actually go out and shadow scientists in the field of different kinds of work, and then together they produce a piece of art with the scientist being the mentor. And so that gives an element of narrative and participation with with an element of valid science, which I think is really important. I hope that wasn't too long. I hope it answered your question, Josh.
Well, that's perfect. Yeah. No, I think all that is crucial and central. And I spend a lot of my day reading through science and trying to communicate it as best I can as a science writer and communicator in that way. I'm not a scientist. I don't profess to be a scientist. I think the idea that you have to be the scientist. Like you're the one in the field and you do the field work and you write the report. And then it's also your job to talk to everyone. That'd be great if that happened more. We do, for instance, there is a scientist here. His name is Dr. Tom Veblen. He's at CU. He's a professor emeritus. And maybe now that he is officially retired, maybe he feels more emboldened to do advocacy, but he has been a rock star because he's been speaking to all the media and elected officials. Basically, he's been saying the stuff that I've been saying for years, but people are able to dismiss people like me, especially because we've been kind of emerging on a new front on certain issues and it's easy to dismiss. But his credibility and legitimacy makes it, he's pretty unimpeachable. But one wouldn't, we would hope that we would not need the scientists themselves. They did their job, and that's the way a lot of scientists look at this. Here it is. You all run with it. And so I do fiction writing as well. So
Mm.
I'm in a weird subgenre of basically it's eco horror, which that's just my thing. And you can see some of my books back there. So what I do is I take
Uh,
science and I put it into an entertaining story. It's a popular subgenre and I can have fun with it and be creative. And I put the story first, but I make sure it's all based on science. I recently just finished another novel in that world. So I can bring some fun stuff. So I can say, hey, here is wildfire ecology. Here's the importance of forest protection. Here are impacts of logging in a paper, or I can write up about something that has been a scientific study or whatever. That's great. And I do want to do that. And we do have to do that. But then I sort of just like, here's a cool story. I'm going to get you engaged in the plot, and then you're going to learn some stuff. And I'm not necessarily going to beat people over the head with it. And I also do that with music. So I've been writing these songs that I call acoustic shadow rock, but they tend to be eco horror. They tend to be like a little dark, and they have natural components. Like I wrote a whole story about or a song about it's called The Most Dangerous Thing in the Forest, just because like it's fun. And then at the end you find out it's actually a moose with a baby. Just, so like a little bit of education about, all these things you think are going to attack you in the forest. Truth of the
yeah.
matter is the moose is the most dangerous thing if it has a baby. So, that was a fun way of doing that. And for folks who want to check out, I'll just do a little self promo, josh'sworstnightmare.substack.com. I try to keep the two worlds separate, but if people do want to check that stuff out, yeah.
Yeah.
And any thoughts about any of that or anything else?
I have a question for the two of you
I think
now.
the other,
And that is, have you run into a situation where conflicting science gets in the way? There's a lot of information out there that leaves what we should do, the path ahead, not completely clear, right? And I can cite a couple of examples. One is forest management, which some consider to be an oxymoron. But you can talk to experts on both sides of that issue. Another example is the uh, the uh, the case for European honeybees. And one of the organizations, larger organizations, actually got sued for promulgating disinformation regarding saving the bees. European honeybees are important to our economy. They're not native bees. So anyway, and I could go on and on with examples. Just saying that it's not cut and dry, but you can pull out science for all kinds of arguments. And I think probably both of you have run into that. And I'd like to know what you think about that.
Yeah, Fran, why don't you start with that?
well, in research, it's always good to have a healthy debate. That's what science is all about in research. It's how we make advancements is to have that communication and looking at all sides of an issue to come away with a better understanding of what's actually occurring. That's just the nature of it. So we're going to see differences. And probably one of the ones that we're looking in the face right now is flooding. FEMA has the flood maps. They're still not ideal, but it's what we have, and it's what insurance reliant on. And there was another nonprofit group that had really made significant advancements on flooding, but they were just bought out by a company. So where that data is going to go, how that's going to be used is a whole nother vantage point. But I think to that point, one of the ideals that we're advancing with UASCA is looking at tools for action. So providing key information, what are the data sources that we have today to rely on? So for example, with heat, how do we look at heat and the heat index? And it includes flooding, and for wildfires, it has some of the best data available. NASA's got virtually almost real-time data where are the wildfires occurring. So that type of information we can have available and in a way that is accessible to people. And so one of the big things that we're working towards is data democratization. How do we bring this data to the public, create a more science literate public, and bringing them along in this effort in a way that it makes science approachable? And we can do this directly through some of these tools. So we're bringing out these applications to let people know if you're in a wildfire area, this is one just to keep on your phone. Look at it, take a glance at it. Heat index, likewise, we've got areas with high heat indexes. Have this available. This is for yourself, your family, your friends, your community to think about. And so that's how we want to approach those together.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. And in my experience, just with particularly on the issue of forests and wildfire, that's a lot of my angle. And we have, we believe based on the evidence that not everything that has been promulgated, first of all, is even based on the science. So there's a lot of assumptions. But, you know, the way I look at it is science is a process and there should be a full spectrum. There shouldn't be suppression of information and evidence. Right now, we have dealt with a lot of that. So what we have is we're seeing a lot of agencies that do have pretty severe conflicts of interest. For instance, the U.S. Forest Service, that it's both there to protect forests and it is the leading entity that is extracting from forests. So, I mean, that's a pretty big conflict of interest
Mhm.
to overcome. A lot of their research is
Mhm.
legitimate,
Mhm.
but you find what I have to do is I have to look at the data versus just the conclusions or the abstract, and you find some really interesting stuff
Mhm.
in there. And of course, as you know, it depends on what you're asking, what you're trying to look at, and then you can find pieces of that. So my opinion is that science is one of the best tools, maybe not the only tool, but it's one of the best, if not the best tool to try to figure out what is real and what isn't. But things can change over time. We can realize that there's limits to it. And yeah, you can probably find a study for anything, but it is worth looking at funding. And I would say the only time that I think it really gets fishy is when there are certain studies that are allowed to be on the public record by, say, a government that is in charge of actually implementation. And then there are all these other studies that just get left out. And, I'll just give you one last example, and then we could move on to something else. But so we're dealing with stuff in Colorado around logging and wildfire, and there's a lot of studies showing that for what they are claiming, it's really not effective. They can make other claims that may be for lower intensity fires that aren't a real threat. So what they're doing is they're using a kernel of truth and they're blowing it up. And then you find that the governments conducted their own studies and it found out that their logging was ineffective or actually made the situation worse. And they did bury their own study. So I was presented with this study that was hidden from the public. And so that's a situation where I would say it's starting to get a little disreputable, where they weren't saying like, well, we think the majority of the science, here's a little conflict in it. We'll try to figure that out. It's just like that doesn't exist, and anyone bringing up is a liar. So yeah, the science world can be fraught depending on. I think if there are entities with vested interests, right? Versus just the curiosity of what do we think right now is objectively true? What's a fact? What might change over time? That's just my take on it.
I think the other layer, in addition to the science right now that we're dealing with, are how are decisions being made at the national level. And so, one example, I and many of my colleagues worked on a regulation that was promulgated in 2024. And this was for Clean Water Act hazardous substances and federal facility responses. And so, this looks at some 300 hazardous substance chemicals and where they may be risks to drinking water supplies and fish, wildlife, and sensitive environments. And this was to be implemented in 27. So now they're looking at delaying it till 2030. And in addition to that, they have pulled back on this regulation to consider how does climate change alter the impacts to drinking water, fish, wildlife, and sensitive environment, while many of these facilities are sitting in floodplains. So removing climate change from that dimension is significant. So the science is one piece, but an independent decision to remove that, just like the Endangered Species Act, they just redefined what harm means. And so harm doesn't mean destruction of habitat, it means injury or death to a given species. So these definitions, so we've got science, but then we also have policies that's changing this and how it's ultimately implemented. And I think that's both of those things right now are just critical drivers.
Great. Well, I have a question for you both. So on this topic of, yeah, science obviously has to be have truth to it to be valid, right? Otherwise, it wouldn't be science. What do you think about art? Should there be an internal truth to it for it to be good art? Is that a quality of good art? Obviously it's fiction, you're telling a fake story, but unless there is some reality in the characters, a reality even if it's a fantasy story following the rules, so that a kind of internal truth. Do you feel like that's a link between science and art, or have I just made that up?
Carol, you want to go first?
Go ahead, Fran. You have a thought?
Uh, I think as long as the proposition is up front, it's fiction or nonfiction, and how you're presenting it. So, if, for example, I think early education is critical. And so, if we can get children to enter into this world and think about it in fiction and knowing like what this effect may be, if that's a way to really bring them in and engage them, I think absolutely do it. And there would be other aspects in terms of the nonfiction that different age groups would relate to in a different way. But I think as well, like I just mentioned with Jill's work, I mean, she creates this art with the data and the facts, and it's just, I mean, it's beautiful. It really resonates and attracts the information, it attracts your attention to that information.
Yeah, she makes art out of graphs. So she can show glaciers in the form of diminishing graphs. Very, very talented artist. And my response to that is sort of looking. I feel like does art ever lie, or does it, resonate at a certain level? And art for communication needs to have a kernel of truth, but the kernel of truth can potentially be a logical conclusion. And so much fiction is not something that's happening right now, but you can understand that it's something that certainly could happen, and and might, given certain circumstances. I mean, look at what is going on on the national stage today, and we would have thought years ago that all of this is total fiction. So I think art
Mm,
needs to have a kernel of truth at least, but there's always kind of a truth in what the artist is expressing. I'm not sure if I said that in a cogent way or not, but um,
Yeah, no,
I
that
hope
makes
that,
sense. No, that
yeah.
makes a lot of sense. I mean, I would say an example of art lying would be like romantic comedies. Like it's like this is not how people act. This is not how relationships are formed, but it's
mm,
pretending in a sense to be real. And weirdly, our culture has like taken on, oh, this is a normal thing. Whereas something like, you know, Dune or whatever, it's just like, all right, obviously no one's pretending that these, creatures are real, but there is this underlying truth to the story that resonates with people, like Star Wars or whatever, right? That there's some deeper truths there that I feel like some of those clearly fictional things are more honest than some of the things that are like, oh yeah, you know how young people are. It's like nobody's like that. So that's to me, that's bad art is
mm,
that it
mm.
doesn't have that honesty at its heart. And it doesn't mean you can't tell you're telling a story. So you're fabricating things out of whole cloth. But like you said, there is
Mhm.
that kernel of truth. I feel like rom-coms, it's just like, no, you would be arrested for stalking if you did that. That's not honest.
Yeah.
But one piece that I think is really relevant is so there's this quote by I believe he was a right wing or right leaning fellow, Andrew Breitbart. So obviously I'm not endorsing any of his other ideas necessarily, but which I don't really know, but I do know that he is at least attributed with a quote saying that politics is downstream of culture, as in you're not just like, here's the bill and now we all believe it. It's like that bill only probably got into place because it was the right time. People were at that. So you can think of things like gay marriage. You could say, well, we got the legislation. It's like, well, by then, most people are like, oh, I know gay people, and why would they? Who cares if they want to get married, you know? And something like, legalization of cannabis, marijuana, whether people agree with it or not, it basically came down to everybody knows somebody who's using it. And they're like, oh, that person seems semi-functional. What are we doing? We're putting him in prison for this. So it wasn't like the law. It's just like the law caught up to the culture in that case. So what do you think about that idea of politics being downstream of culture?
Oh, very much so. Just in my experience with the EPA, so many times we, as a national government, were forced into a situation because of public outcry. So, if you get me, just an example, going back to 1990 and the Exxon Valdez spill, people saw this pristine environment contaminated and seeing whales and otters coated in oil and thinking this is not acceptable. Well, the agency was forced to come up with the Oil Pollution Act. So that was a positive outcome. It was really that public outcry that really shaped that, and the politicians then got behind that. So I would very much agree with that proposition.
Any thoughts on that, Carol?
Yeah, I would echo what Fran says there. And um, yeah, I'll just leave it at that. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Yeah. Uh, So another piece I had that I was typing here and almost knocked my mouse off the table was so in your opinion, should artists make an attempt to be science literate, or should artists kind of just remain in the world of just pure creativity? And yeah, so that would be my first, part of this question here. So should artists make an attempt to be scientifically literate? Let's just say they're painting landscapes. I mean, do they have to know xylem and phloem, stuff like that? What do you think?
I think it helps the conversation and helps the broad science literacy in bringing that in to make the science approachable. I think we've diverged from the point. So if you're out of formal education, the extent of science that individuals are exposed to, unless they have a predisposition to pursue that, it's not something that comes to them. But I feel very strongly that now with climate change that we need to really embody people to really take this issue on. And my feelings really come from working on the response to Hurricane Katrina, being on the ground 3 weeks after this event and seeing how people were impacted by this and not having the wherewithal, the resources to help manage that. We're in a different endpoint right now, 20 years later, where data is so much more accessible to people that we've got really a gift in that data accessibility and bringing that to people. So, for example, even in the LA wildfires last year, people were scrambling, trying to figure out, well, what do I even monitor? When is it safe to come back in my home? And so there are elements of information that you can find online really to get that. And so if we bring art into that dimension, again, it makes it approachable and in a way that really improve that science literacy for everyone's benefit, for community's benefit, and be able to really both prepare and respond to these events.
Sure. Any thoughts on that, Carol, whether artists should be science literate?
Science literate. And I believe that art serves so many functions that one aspect of climate art can be informational, but another aspect of it um, is to inspire. It's inspirational, right? And I think in order to um, to be credible as an artist who is trying to inspire, there needs to be an element of what's really happening, and that would be the science. But you know, there are different kinds of climate art. There's very dystopian climate art that serves a certain
Mhm.
purpose, that sort of horrifies people into action. And other people, it is actually repulsive. Um, and then there's the art that is sort of, don't we appreciate what we have? And here's the paradise that we're turning into a parking lot, and let's really live in the paradise and know what we're working toward. And I think neither of those, all that both of those kinds of art, you know, assume an element of knowledge of the science of what's going on, but don't necessarily have to sort of be immersed in the science in a way. Um,
Mhm.
yeah,
They make the science approachable.
Right.
they make the science approachable. I think that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, I like the inspiration. Well, you referenced Big Yellow Taxi from Joni Mitchell. So a song from, I don't know if it was the 70s, early 70s. So, and this was actually the next question I was going to ask you, because is there a risk of art with too much of an agenda turning into just propaganda? How important is it to maintain the integrity of the art itself, making sure you're creating, so like in a story, I make sure I'm gonna have solid characters. I'm gonna have a cool plot. I'm gonna try to explore the issue. Sure, I have a message. Big Yellow Taxi was a great song. So, interesting chord structure. She's a talented performer. The lyrics tell a story. She does get a message across about, paving paradise and putting up a parking lot, but it probably would not have been as effective if it wasn't a well-crafted song. So what do you think about that? What's the edge
Oh, yeah.
of that?
Oh, absolutely. That's critical. And it's the artist's integrity, it's the science integrity. And what we hope for is that that can be merged within an individual to really digest that information, express that in a way that preserves our artist integrity and the beauty, really, of what's produced. And as Carol suggested, there may be some that, yes, it's dystopian. So you're going to grab an audience in that way too. But you also, I mean, if somebody's going to purchase art, you still want something surrounding you that's also going to present some hope for our future collectively. And so there are different avenues to look at different purposes for the art and different venues to think about it. But I think the preservation of the artist's integrity is absolutely key to that.
Anything on that, Carol?
Yes, I'm trying to think of the sort of the worst examples of artist integrity
Hmm.
and what you call bad art. And I do believe we see a lot of that in advertising. Um,
Mm,
and
yeah.
yeah. This is sort of like and this shows my age, Zen and the art of motorcycle maintenance, in terms of what is quality. And so we're sort of discussing what is integrity. And I think we might know it when we see it.
Right.
Um, uh, and, but it can certainly be tricky.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great point
Yeah.
about
And an artist is
advertising.
going to be comparable.
Oh, go
Yeah,
on.
the artist is going to be comfortable what their boundaries are on integrity, and so that's a personal decision and then a focus, like how, to what extent do they want to embody this information and express this in an artistic way? But yeah, there's a broader one that, as you express in looking at advertising, that's a whole different venue. But in terms of our world and thinking about the integration of science and climate with artistry, I think very much it's an artistic outlet.
Yeah, what's interesting though is it tends to be what right brain, left brain stuff. So a lot of the times the artist folks are not as science minded and vice versa. Maybe there's some of us that can cross that boundary. I have more the artist brain, and then I just over time and through arduous effort just started to delve more into the scientific world. But I mean, we should probably wrap up in a moment, but I did want to ask you before we get to the last question. So I would be remiss not to ask you about AI at this point when it comes to art. So is AI, in your both of your individual opinions, is it the death of art, or is it a decadent period, or is it just a new tool for creating art? What do you think? Fran, we'll start with you.
Well, yeah, it's in some ways it's a different path, and probably the one that comes to my mind is just looking at some of the digital art that was produced early on and thinking, okay, digital art versus, an artist expressing this in their own means. And in the beginning, I was really, it really takes away that special talent of individuals. But in seeing what's been produced digitally over time, I've really come to understand how the beauty in that and the artistry. So it really combines, the science element of it too with the artistry. And there's some just fabulous pieces. And probably one of the things that really turned me in that direction were some of the works that were out of Burning Man. This has been a number of years ago, but the digital art that they had produced for some of those events was just phenomenal. And so I think we're looking at AI now, and in a way, I don't see that there's necessarily competition. I think as we recognize this is an individual's artists and their expression of a given subject versus AI. I think it's up to individuals who are receiving that art. How do they want to think about that art and utilize that art, or possibly purchase that art? So it's very different. So we're coming to another plateau and thinking about AI and art. I'm probably not at the point that I've completely crossed that bridge into the AI world, because I'm so respectful of artists and the creativity that's driven by individuals. So that's going to be probably a tougher bridge for me to cross.
Sure. Thanks for that. And Carol?
Well, I have many friends who horribilize about the future of AI, and I certainly understand that it can take the place of human creativity. Um, and I'll go into the environmental damage it's doing in a moment, but I feel
Mm,
like we can learn to dance with AI. And if you know art history, you will understand all over the world that there is no art without inspiration generated by other art and other artists. It all grows from ideas. And I think that AI, we sh- that we can, of course, let I do all the creating while we sit back and do nothing. But we can also use AI for creative juices. We could say, oh, well, it's doing this, but and I like that about it, but I would like to bring this into the concept and make my own based on what I've learned from AI. So, I think we can work with AI. Um, and but right now, and I do use AI for various technological problems. Mostly I ask how to get a printer back online and such, and it's just really useful, I will have to say. But I feel a little bit guilty about what it's doing to the environment as I'm using all this computing power. How are we going to come to terms with that in terms of climate change? Um, and that is a question that I think is foremost in dealing with AI.
Yeah, I think that's a good overview of the concerns there and some of the possible benefits as some people lay it out there. So, yeah, I really want to thank you both for all your work and for coming on the podcast. And then the last question I like to ask ties into the concept of the Green Root podcast, getting to the roots of the ecological crisis. So, maybe we'll start with you first, Carol. What would you say is a root cause of the or a part of the eco crisis? You don't have to understand everything that's ever happened in the world. So yeah, what's your take on that?
Well, I think first on my list, and I do believe it's a syndrome. There's not a single root cause, and it's something we've been working toward ever since the Industrial Revolution. But I think my single biggest um, problem with or root cause is disconnection from nature. We live in our air-conditioned consumer bubbles, and we don't mind paving parking lots or the rose garden or whatever it is we're paving over because we think nothing is lost. We have totally failed to connect to how everything works together. Um, and beyond that, that leads into a feeling hegemony of being the super species, and we can get, whatever we want out of this world, which brings on sort of a disbelief, that climate denial, a higher power would not do this to us. I can't believe that. Um, and 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 then all this results in for many, a kind of resignation. There's nothing we can do, a hopelessness, and that's where we need to fit in. We need a can-do model.
Great. Thank you for that. And Fran, what's your take on a root cause of the ecological crisis?
I think one of them is the disconnect that we have on the critical issues affecting climate change and how the public is engaged. Um, I was in 1990, it was the 20th anniversary of Earth Day, and I was in DC on the Capitol steps and looking over the mall towards Washington Monument, and it was such a celebration. It was packed with people, and the power behind that population there and the energy behind the environment. And I really felt, okay, we have done it. We are here. But as many of us have, of course, found, unless you're tending to this, that dissipates. So it's the same with the environment and climate change as it is with our democracy. If we're not tending to this, if we're not saying this is how you need to be engaged and work together to advance these issues, we can't protect it. And so that's really the heart of what we're hoping to gain, is engaging people in a way and meeting them at their level and helping to understand really what's at stake here in our future.
Great. Yeah, both great answers. Thank you for that. Thank you for everything you're doing. What's the best way that people can find out about your all's work and organizations?
Artistsforclimateawareness.org has the work of both organizations, and so you can poke around and see what all we're doing. I think that Artists for Climate Awareness has a multi-year history of all kinds of events. UASCA is very new, and we're hoping that UASCA can take what Artists for Climate Awareness has been doing and scale it up.
And we're hoping to folks come to the site. We did the Louisville event, but our idea is to create this fractal environment. So this is repeated in different cities around the country. So we very much hope to gather people to collaborate with us. So absolutely, if you're interested in a work group and another city, and as we develop our plans, we're looking at other cities to go to. We absolutely want people, we want artists, we want scientists, and we want others who want to engage and really take some action on this issue. So please come to the website and take a look. And as well, we have tools for action there, what people can start doing now at the moment as well.
Excellent. Well, thank you both for everything.
Okay,
and thank you for
your
having
efforts
us
too.
Green Root.
Yeah,
it's an honor.
I appreciate your efforts and what you're doing.
Of course.